Good day. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the 2020 New Jersey Historical Conference, Battles for the Ballot, hosted by my fantastic colleagues at the New Jersey Historical Commission, led by Sarah Curaton, the State Archives, led by Joe Collette, and our partners at NJ Women Vote 100, the Alice Paul Institute, and NJ Digital Highway. Now, it would be an understatement to say it's been a historic year. Since March, COVID-19 has impacted the way that we all live and work. It has even touched upon the way that we vote, both here in New Jersey and across the nation. In our state, we moved to a hybrid election format for both our primary and general, with county clerks mailing eligible voters a ballot, and about half of the usual polling locations were open on Election Day. This could not have been done without the heroic and steady work of our local election workers who are truly on the front lines of our democracy. The result? New Jersey will likely notch the highest voter turnout in state history in the middle of a global pandemic. And while folk were casting their votes, there may be those who were not thinking about the great Americans who came before us, like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, or Alice Paul. Those who were determined to see the 15th and 19th Amendments law. Still, the way that Americans nationally persevered voting in record turnouts, despite a pandemic, is a fitting tribute to those who fought and sacrificed to secure the vote. Now, before I close, I'd be remiss if I didn't note the other ways that New Jersey made history in terms of voter access this year. First, in March, the franchise was expanded to those serving parole or probation. And we launched online voter registration, making voting more accessible to a population of voters and potential voters who are more likely to use the internet to do their business. Ultimately, I believe our mandate at the State Division of Elections and in my capacity as Secretary of State is to protect our elections while making it easy as possible for every eligible voter to participate. Under these unprecedented circumstances, I'm proud of how incredibly well everything went, and I believe what we learned from this year will shape our democracy for decades to come. And regardless of where you may stand on the political spectrum, I hope we can all appreciate that for the first time in American history, a presidential ticket that includes a woman has been elected to the White House. We haven't even begun to grasp what this will mean for women and people of color and how this will shape our democracy in the years ahead. Really, that's what history is all about and what this day is all about, right? The people, movements, and key moments in time that shaped who and how we vote are worthy of discussion, and I'm sure your discussions on 2020 will be the first of many. Finally, congrats to our prize winners and honorees whose work in contributing to our shared history is worthy of recognition. Kudos to our keynote speaker and all our panelists for participating. It is a true privilege to serve as New Jersey's top election official, and I'm grateful for all of your contributions to the study of this history in the making. Enjoy the rest of the conference and stay safe. It is my hope that we'll be seeing each other in person come 2021.
Thank you, Secretary Way. I'm Sarah Curaton, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission. Before we begin, I want to just add one more generous partner to our list of thank yous, the Department of American Studies at Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences. I also want to thank the members of our extraordinary conference planning committee, whose names are listed in the program. I hope you'll take a look and thank them as you see them in the days to come. And let me add one more thank you, and that is to the hardworking staff of the New Jersey Historical Commission, especially in this case, Madeline Rosenberg, who has served as the lead staff person coordinating today's event. Now, we will begin the morning's main event, our keynote panel. This year, we are honored to feature 3 nationally regarded experts on voting rights history and contemporary issues. Professor Martha S. Jones, who will speak first, is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, winner of numerous awards, including the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the best book in civil rights history. Published in 2020 is Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Fought for Rights for All. Today, she's at work on a biography of US Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney. Professor Jones is also a public historian, frequently writing for outlets including the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, and Time, curating museum exhibitions, including Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation, and collaborating with partners, including the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Southern Poverty Law Center, PBS, and Netflix. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University. Our second speaker, Ari Berman, is a senior reporter at Mother Jones, covering voting rights. His stories have also appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, Politico, and The Guardian. He is a frequent guest, excuse me for that, and political commentator on MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. Mr. Berman's work has earned him an Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media and a place on the FT 200 awardees whose work embodies Frederick Douglass's enduring legacy of social change. Mr. Berman is the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction. Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics, and the forthcoming Minority Rule, about efforts by white conservatives to entrench power in the face of a massive demographic and political shift. Give Us the Ballot was named a Best Book of 2015 by the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and others, and was nominated for the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. While Professor Jones and Mr. Berman will start us off primarily with historical context, they will be joined by Ryan P. Haygood, who will serve as today's expert commentator, offering his own remarks before moderating discussion. Mr. Haygood, a nationally respected civil rights lawyer, is president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where he leads a majority women of color team of racial justice advocates whose cutting-edge work, powered by grassroots organizing, research, writing, policy, and legislative advocacy and litigation, seeks to build reparative systems that create wealth, justice, and power for Black, Latina, Latino, and other people of color in New Jersey. Prior to leading the Institute, Mr. Haygood served as Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Incorporated, where he worked for more than a decade. At LDF, Mr. Haygood litigated some of the most important civil rights cases of our time, including defending the Voting Rights Act before the Supreme Court. A passionate advocate, Mr. Haygood speaks and writes regularly on issues concerning race, law, social justice, democracy, and power. Mr. Haygood received his JD from the University of Colorado School of Law and BA in American History and Political Science, cum laude, from Colorado College, where he was nominated for the Rhodes Scholarship and earned academic and athletic All-American and Hall of Fame honors as a football player. Now, following the panelists' discussion, we hope there will be some time to address audience questions. As questions occur to you, please type them in the Q&A box, which we will monitor and convey to the panelists. While we cannot applaud together, please join me now in virtually welcoming this terrific panel of experts. And now I will turn it over to Professor Jones.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the kind introduction, Sarah. Thank you to everyone there for convening us. I can't imagine a more auspicious week for our conversation that will take us through the past, the present, and I hope also the future of voting rights in the United States. I want to say a special thank you to Madeline Rosenberg, who I think everyone connected with this meeting knows has been tireless behind the scenes in convening us and helping us adapt this meeting to our new circumstances. So thank you so much, Madeline. My role today is to talk some about the history of women in the vote. We are in 2020 at the anniversary year of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, oftentimes referred to as the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And I want to tell that story, or at least a bit of it, from the perspective of African-American women. I hope it's a story that will resonate with you as we think about the struggles, the dilemmas, and the possibilities for voting rights in our own time. And I'll look forward to the discussion. When we talk about women in the vote and this anniversary year, it's useful, I think, to start by pointing out two myths that surround the 19th Amendment. The first goes something like the 19th Amendment won American women the vote. Perhaps you've even heard it said that the 19th Amendment guaranteed to American women the right to vote. There's one myth we'll bust this morning. The second is a myth that almost runs contrary to the first. And it is that in 1920, no Black American women gained the vote, that racism kept Black American women from the polls. We'll look at that too. In this anniversary year, while I'm not someone who plans celebrations, I'm a historian. Part of my work is to do a bit of myth busting, but I hope more to the point to replace some of the misunderstandings around the 19th Amendment with good and useful history that illuminates the ongoing challenges related to voting rights. But before we dive too deep, let's just take a look at the 19th Amendment and remember precisely what it says. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Now, laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution, and still the 19th Amendment did not promise women the vote. Laws, state laws, still kept women from the polls based upon age, citizenship, residency, mental competence. In 1920, it was still true that American women who married non-citizens were denaturalized and lost their citizenship and their right to vote. So in 1920, when American women show up to register in that fall, they confront many hurdles, even if sex was no longer one of them. Of course, there was one additional barrier to women's votes that persisted even after a federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870 had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race, but by 1920, lawmakers in the American South and West had set in place hurdles that, while silent on their face about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Along with that, unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the right to vote in 1920? Not all women. African-American women in too many states became mere equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in a sort of end run around the spirits of the 15th and 19th Amendments, and the registration numbers in 1920 reflect the effect of these discriminatory laws. Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but too many found that the books were indeed closed. And at the same time, even before 1920, the first waves of Black women voters had been unleashed as individual states made women's suffrage the law. In California, starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, and New York in 1917, Black women were already experienced voters by 1920. And in those places, even more managed to register and cast ballots in the fall of that year in the wake of the 19th Amendment. How did they do that? Two quick examples. One comes from St. Louis, Missouri, where Black women organized under the auspices of the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA. They run a suffrage school, teach each other how to pass literacy tests, how to pay a poll tax, how to interpret the Constitution in front of voting officials. Black women in St. Louis, as newspapers reported, vote 100% in 1920. Why did they come to the polls? Yes, to, if you will, breathe life into the terms of the 19th Amendment, to expand the American body politic to include women. But at the same time, Black women in St. Louis have come to the polls to defeat the rising tide of Jim Crow in their city. Local officials are using ballot initiatives to set in place a housing segregation regime in St. Louis. And Black women are eager and deliberate about getting to the polls to combat racism, even as they are also realizing a newfound right as women. Our other example comes from Daytona, Florida, where in that same season, educator and club movement leader Mary McLeod Bethune is traveling Florida to register Black women to vote, doing much of the same sort of work that women in St. Louis were doing through their suffrage school. Mrs. Bethune, in contrast to this experience in St. Louis, Mrs. Bethune confronts a tidal wave of terroristic violence that is rampaging through the state of Florida in 1920, directly aimed at African-American voting rights organizers. She, through her work, wins regrettably the attention of the Ku Klux Klan, and on Election Day Eve in 1920, the Klan will assemble in downtown Daytona, march in full regalia on horseback to the campus of Mrs. Bethune's School for African-American Girls, what is today Bethune-Cookman University, in an effort to intimidate her, to intimidate her faculty, and to intimidate the Black women of Daytona. Now, the next morning, Mrs. Bethune gets up, and the organizer that she is helps Black women in Daytona to come to the polls. They gather in numbers. They come as a collective to the polls, looking for the safety in numbers. And this will be their tactic until 1922, when, as the violence they had confronted in 1920 persists, Mrs. Bethune and Black Americans in Florida are largely defeated in this early struggle for voting rights. The violence is relentless, the violence is unchecked, and it, in effect, cancels the influence of the 19th Amendment in the state of Florida. So what are Black women to do in this moment? When they look out across the landscape in the fall of 1920, after the November election season settles, they recognize that too many of them remain disenfranchised, that they are having profoundly uneven and unequal experiences when it comes to voting rights, and responsibility for resolving this dilemma falls in part to Harlequin Brown, who is the president of the National Association of Colored Women, the largest political association of Black women in the United States in 1920, some 300,000 plus members across the United States, including in cities like Daytona, Florida, and St. Louis in Missouri. Harlequin Brown sets her sights on winning federal legislation that would give teeth to the 15th and 19th Amendments and open the way for Black women's success at the polls. She needs a strategy, and she looks to Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party and admired by many as one of the most innovative, persistent, creative and radical of the suffragists who bring the 19th Amendment to fruition. She pays a call on Alice Paul to ask Paul to join with African-American women of the NACW in a campaign to now win federal legislation. And while the words that they exchange do not survive for us, we do know what Alice Paul did next. And in the winter of 1921, she will begin to fold up the National Women's Party. And by 1923, we'll move on in a campaign for yet another federal amendment, that of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still awkwardly making its way to ratification even today. The lesson of the story, I think, is twofold. One, that in 1920, voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand. They were part of a joint scheme that gives us the 19th Amendment in that year. It was no secret among suffragists, among lawmakers, and certainly no secret to Black American women that the 19th Amendment would do nothing to interfere with, to disturb, or to override state laws, along with intimidation and violence that threatened to keep Black American women from the polls. I want to end by invoking the figure of now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Senator Harris, now Vice President-elect Harris, is someone who I think embodies for us how much has changed since 1920 for African American women when it comes to voting rights and political rights. Her now rise to the office of the vice presidency is a reflection of a larger wave or force of African American women in our national politics, remembering, of course, that she was one of 6 Black women, all formidable candidates who appeared on Joe Biden's shortlist last summer, remembering that she ran this season alongside 120 Black women who were running for seats in Congress, a record-shattering number of Black women aiming to hold office in Washington. And she, in essence, ran alongside the 90+% of African American women who not only showed up to the polls, but who supported the Democratic ticket, voting as a bloc as they have since 1920. Kamala Harris is, if you will, the tip of that iceberg that is the force of African American women in politics today. I'll take you back as I close to her remarks in August of this year when she accepted the nomination during the Democratic Convention. And she spoke of the women on whose shoulders she stands today. There was her own mother, an immigrant from India, a researcher, a scientist, who instilled in her daughters the sense that they could and should aim for high ideals, even the unprecedented. But then Kamala Harris went on to invoke 6 Black American women as a way of illustrating the political tradition, the path breakers, the inspirations, the sheroes who had come before her in this long struggle for voting rights among African American women, in this long struggle for political power. I'm going to name them: Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. If these are not names that are familiar to you, this season is your opportunity to expand your pantheon when it comes to American political greats. Senator Harris reminds us that it is not enough to invoke the founders. It is not enough to invoke figures like Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that in this season, in this 21st century season of American politics, these 6 women are as essential, as critical, and as decisive as any in bringing us to this moment. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. And I believe I'm going to pass the mic, as it were, to Ari Berman. Thanks so much, Ari.
Thanks so much, Martha. That was wonderful. And I'm really honored to be here at this very timely convening. And I'm honored to be here with Martha and Ryan, 2 people that I've learned so much from and who have been tireless fighters and chroniclers of voting rights. So I'm going to give you some historical context too, and then talk a little bit about what happened in this election as well, because I have covered the ins and outs of voting, both in a historical way, but also in terms of how it's all played out in this election. And I mean, this was really a historic year in a lot of different ways, not just because of the election, but also because of some of the titans of voting rights that we lost in the past year. And particularly throughout this election, I thought a lot about John Lewis, the great civil rights leader, former congressman from Georgia, and who we lost in July of this year. And he was someone that I got to know well. I know Ryan knew him well. And I was lucky enough to take 2 civil rights pilgrimages to Alabama with John Lewis and members of Congress, both in 2013 and in 2015 for the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis was brutally beaten marching for voting rights on March 7th, 1965. And every time I crossed that bridge with John Lewis, I thought about what he must have been going through at that point in time. That when John Lewis marched on what became known as Bloody Sunday, only 300 of 15,000 African Americans in Selma, Alabama were registered to vote. There were things like literacy tests. If you wanted to register, you had to name all 67 county judges to be able to register to vote, something that the 67 county judges themselves would have never been able to do had they been asked that question. Whites were not asked those kind of questions, but Blacks routinely were. There were poll taxes. You actually had to pay to register to vote. There were grandfather clauses. So Blacks were not able to vote because they were enslaved, but whites were exempted from these categories because their ancestors had been able to vote. There were young civil rights activists like Andrew Goodman and James Chaney and Michael Schwerner who went down to Mississippi and were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan simply for trying to register people to vote. So I thought a lot about this in the election season, which there was so much talk about voting, but the history of voting seemed more important than ever. And when the demonstrations around the death and murder of George Floyd happened, I thought of another martyr of the Selma movement, a man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was 25 years old, the youngest deacon at his church, had tried to register to vote 5 different times in Marion, Alabama, which was next to Selma, Alabama. And Jimmy Lee Jackson took part in a night march in Marion, Alabama in February of 1965. And Alabama state troopers attacked the night march, and they tried to beat Jimmy Lee Jackson's mother and grandfather. And Jimmy Lee Jackson stepped in, and he was shot and murdered by Alabama state troopers. And John Lewis and other civil rights activists were so angry about the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson that they had the idea to march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, holding Jimmy Lee Jackson's casket to dramatize the murder and disenfranchisement of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. And so when all of this stuff was happening, when we were having this reckoning with white supremacy and police brutality and voter suppression, I thought about those people like John Lewis, who were very well known, but also those people like Jimmy Lee Jackson, who were less known, and how they paved the way for what was happening today, and how much progress had been made, but also the fact that we were fighting the same kind of fights in 2020 that we were fighting in 1965. And we celebrated not only the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act this year, but as Martha said, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And in a lot of ways, we celebrated the progress. There would have been no victory for Joe Biden without the VRA or without the 19th Amendment. But it's also true that voters faced unprecedented obstacles to vote this year. Some of those obstacles were new, but some of them were part of a longer term strategy. Since the 2010 election, half the states in the country have passed new restrictions on voting. That's when I first started covering this topic. Things like strict voter ID laws and cutbacks to early voting and purging the voting rolls and closing polling places. Then in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act and ruled that those states with the longest history of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. That allowed discriminatory laws to go into effect for the first time. Things like a voter ID law in Texas, where you could vote with a gun permit but not a student ID. What was different about this year was not that there were barriers to voting, but how the pandemic became weaponized to make it harder to vote. And I had never heard so many questions about how to vote from people this year. Was it safe to vote by mail? Would the post office deliver my ballot in time? Could I vote in person? Would it be safe? Would my polling place still be there? I mean, there was so much uncertainty about how to cast a ballot. And usually a voter suppression happens in back rooms and people don't really know about it. But the president and his allies were so open about the kind of suppression that they were doing this year. They admitted that they didn't want to fund the post office because they didn't want to expand mail voting. You had officials decide that they were going to have only one location to be able to drop your mail ballot off in places like Texas. So there was only one place to drop your mail ballot off in Harris County, Texas, which had 2.4 million registered voters, was larger than the state of Rhode Island, and had more people than 27 states. The day before the election, I was covering attempts to try to throw out 127,000 votes in Harris County, Texas, that were cast through drive-through voting, which was done as an alternative to have people be able to vote safely because of COVID. So I think this openness, the bluntness of voter suppression this year, both made people understand the strategy, but also built a movement to overcome it that we had not seen in previous elections, that people really did get the message, that they had to be proactive, that they had to make a plan to be able to vote. And that's why I think we saw a record turnout in this election. We saw 100 million Americans vote early, and people really be determined to not have their votes suppressed. And it's really amazing when you think about the results of the election. I think I tweeted a day or two after election night that the 15th and 19th and the 26th Amendments finally got their revenge. And what I meant by that is that this election was powered by voters of color. It was powered by women. It was powered by young voters. And if you look at who made the difference in this election, it was not white voters. It was not people like me. It was Black voters in cities like Atlanta and Philadelphia and Detroit. It was Latino voters in states like Nevada and Arizona. It was Native American voters in places like Arizona. These are the people that showed up in record numbers to defend their franchise. And I know there's been a lot of talk about how this post-election period is going to turn out. The president and his allies are saying a lot of things that are just completely untrue about voting. And that is very worrisome to me because I have studied American elections for a decade, and I can tell you comprehensively that there is no evidence of systematic, widespread voter fraud. I didn't need the front page of the New York Times to tell me this. I've known this for quite some time. People that run our elections have known this for quite some time, but it is worrisome how the president's lies are becoming weaponized here. That said, I have confidence the system will work like it worked during the election, that people were able to come out and vote in record numbers. Their votes were counted. At the end of the day, I believe those votes will be decisive. We are going to get those votes certified relatively soon. I believe the votes will be certified in most states by the end of November or at the latest early December. Electors will meet December 14th, and Trump will leave office on January 20th of next year. And I know some people are invoking a lot of nightmare scenarios. I believe those are still nightmare scenarios. I do not believe those are likely scenarios, and we can talk about them more later. At the same time, despite the fact that there is a new president elected, there are still a lot of threats to voting rights that still exist. Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans are still blocking legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act. They are still blocking legislation to make it easier to vote. If there is no change in the US Senate, those critical pieces of legislation will continue to be blocked. At the state level, Republicans are still in control of the redistricting process in a lot of key states, meaning that they're going to be able to do the kind of gerrymandering at the state level that they did in the past decade, which is another worrisome development. I'm worried that all of the rhetoric that we're hearing about illegal votes is going to lead to new restrictions on the franchise. It's going to lead to efforts to try to make it harder to vote by mail, or to make it harder to vote early, or to target the methods that led to record turnout in this election. So I think we should celebrate the fact that we had record turnout, the fact that history was not able to repeat itself, that people with a tremendous amount of organizing and effort and determination were able to overcome some of the barriers that were put in front of them. But this is not a time to be complacent. We have to recognize that the fight for voting rights is not over, that we took a step forward in many ways in 2020, but it's also possible that we could take steps back as well. And so I thank you all so much for hosting this discussion, and I am going to pass it over to my friend Ryan right now.
Thanks so much, Ari. It's so special for me to share this space with you, Ari, my dear friend, and you, Martha. And I just want to thank the New Jersey Historical Commission for convening us at such a timely moment in our history, and thank Madeline and Sarah and Greer for their teamwork to pull this together at this moment. So I just wanted to say a few words reacting to Ari and Martha's presentations, to share a bit about how we've been thinking about how this work is played out in the state of New Jersey, and then to sort of frame it in the framework that Dr. King gave us 50 years ago when he, more than 50 years ago, when he wrote his last book, Chaos or Community. I've been rereading it. I really urge folks, along with reading Ari and Martha's books, to take a close look at this book. It's really fascinating that he wrote this book 52 or 3 years ago, and it is as relevant today as it was when he penned the book 1 year before his assassination. And so if you would, Greer, bring up the first slide. This is a picture of Dr. King, to Ari's point, walking through Selma with a group of folks as part of the Bloody Sunday aftermath. And it's a poster that my organization that I lead, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, created as part of our theme for this year. And so we reviewed, so you'll see here, we attached a quote from the conclusion of the book, where Dr. King says, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. This may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos or community." And the reason that this book struck me is because that idea, right, the idea of choosing community over chaos, is as relevant today as it was when Dr. King wrote this book. Because America, for a good portion of the last many years, has been chaos. And what we learned from this book, we learned from what Martha and Ari share in their presentations about the contested nature of democracy in this country, is that we build community from the ground up in our communities. There's never been a movement that started in Washington, D.C. down. It has always commenced from the ground up in our neighborhoods. And it is in our neighborhoods where we're most powerful, when we organize around things that impact us, when we organize in a way that gets Washington, D.C. to pay attention. But Washington, D.C. on its own has never sparked any movements, right? Those have always come from the ground up in our communities. And so you'll see at the bottom of the poster, we say that we're not waiting for democracy to come to us from Washington, D.C. down. We're building it from the ground up in our communities. And we saw this play out very powerfully in this past election, as Ari spoke to. So I just want to spend a few minutes walking through what chaos has looked like sort of in New Jersey, and how we have, from the ground up in our neighborhoods, really worked to build community in a number of different respects. So if you would, Greer, turn to the next slide for me, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. So this you see is a young boy with a backpack standing on a foundation, right? And we've been thinking a lot about how in this particular moment, especially where we're confronting a number of pandemics, the coronavirus pandemic, the police brutality pandemic, the structural racism pandemic, that we are all of us standing on a foundation that is cracked, and it's cracked by structural racism. And it's through those cracks that we are experiencing real earthquakes in Black and other communities of color. And so we've been holding this idea in our minds because it particularly now, in this really painful moment, even given the way that we're conducting this conversation, right? We're doing this in a socially distanced way because it isn't safe to be together. And the particular pandemic we're talking about, the coronavirus pandemic, is itself a pandemic that preys on the underlying conditions found disproportionately in communities of color. And that itself, we have now learned, right, is itself a function of structural racism, that the coronavirus preys on those conditions found too often in communities of color. And so if you would turn, Greer, to the next slide, I just want to lift up for you concretely how this shows up in numbers. And so this is a powerful outline of George Floyd. This is the New Yorker, the cover of the New Yorker back in June 2022. I talked about the police brutality pandemic. I was struck by this image because in the middle of it is there's a gentleman on the ground. He's surrounded by 4 police officers. That white car is a Hyundai, right? This was a popular car in the early 1990s. This is a photo, March 3rd, 1991. That person on the ground is Rodney King. And he's surrounded by 4 police officers in Los Angeles who brutalized him. They beat him about the head and shoulders 59 times. It's captured on video, right? The old school camcorder captured this, and it took federal civil rights charges before 2 of those 4 officers were convicted on federal civil rights violations, but they were acquitted on state charges. And I lift this up because this is nearly 30 years ago, and we continue to have conversations about the pandemic of police brutality against Black folks. And this is part of a broader pandemic that we're experiencing across the country and also here in New Jersey as these numbers lay bare. So if you turn to the next slide for me, please. So this is an image we created at the Institute, which is an interesting metaphor, right? I think it's true for everyone that life is kind of like a staircase, right? And there are challenges associated with living, right? You just confront adversity and do your best to overcome it. But in New Jersey, these stairs are particularly steep for Black folks. And so this is a number of racial disparities that Black people in particular confront in New Jersey. And New Jersey is fascinating because it is at once one of the wealthiest states in the country, but it's also a state where this incredible wealth exists along some real punishing poverty. We're one of the most racially diverse states in the country, but that racial diversity also exists alongside some really deep, some really entrenched racial segregation in our neighborhoods and in our schools. It's a state with some of the most powerful healthcare networks, and those powerful, well-resourced healthcare networks exist along some real lack of access for too many people to that healthcare network. And so I just want to lift up a few of the racial disparities, give you a sense of how those cracks concretely show up in our community. So the first one I just want to lift up is if you go up 2 steps, you'll see $352,000 in yellow. This is the median net wealth for white families in New Jersey. $352,000. This is the highest net wealth of any family in the country. $352,000, white families, median net wealth in New Jersey, highest in America. But if you look to the right, you'll see the versus that separates 352, and it says $6,100. $6,100 is the median net wealth for New Jersey's Black families, and it's $7,300 for New Jersey's Latino families. Incredible racial wealth gap. $352,000, highest net wealth of any family in the country for white families in New Jersey, versus just $6,100 for Black families. If you go up 2 more steps, you'll see 21 to 1. 21 to 1 is the Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in New Jersey. So in New Jersey, a Black child is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white child. This too is the highest racial disparity in America, even though research shows that Black and white kids commit most offenses at about the same rate. And so in New Jersey, a state of more than 9 million people, today there are 8, so less than 10, 8 white kids in prison, and the rest are Black and Latino. Now we know, but this is obviously not a push to incarcerate more white children, but it is a reflection of the reality that in New Jersey, when white kids do things that kids often do, and when white kids get in trouble, there's a vastly different response to the white kids versus the one that we afford to Black and brown kids. And then finally, if you go up 1 more step, you'll see 62%. 62% is the percentage of those who were denied the right to vote because of a criminal conviction in New Jersey. So we have these incredible racial disparities in the criminal justice system, 21 to 1 for Black kids. It's 12 to 1 for Black adults, meaning a Black adult in New Jersey is 12 times more likely to be in prison than a white adult. And because New Jersey, like most states, with the exception of Maine and Vermont, and now Washington, D.C., because New Jersey connects voting to the criminal justice system, New Jersey literally imports those racial disparities, that racism from the criminal justice system into the political process, such that 62% of those who could not previously vote because of criminal convictions were Black. And we argue that that is, as these other racial disparities show, that is by design, that these are not reflections of individual failures. No, these are symptoms, these are reflections. These are caused by a system of structural racism that's rooted in New Jersey's own history with slavery. New Jersey is often not thought of as a state where slavery took root very, very deeply, but it did. As one of the early American colonies, New Jersey gave English settlers 100 acres to settle their land here. And then New Jersey gave those same folks an additional 100 acres of land if they had enslaved people work on that land. And when formal slavery ended in New Jersey, sharecropping emerged. And after sharecropping came to an end, things like restrictive covenants and redlining and predatory lending practices persisted, so that the racial disparity I lifted up today in net wealth is directly connected to New Jersey's history of slavery. That the reason we see a staggering racial wealth gap today is not because Black and brown folks are prodigal with their finances or allergic to wealth, or that there's something wrong with our DNA. No, the reason it's so low for Black folks and Latino folks, the reason it's so high for white folks is because there was a system designed, conceived of, birthed in slavery in New Jersey that's persisted to the modern day. And the reason all of this matters is because the way you change systems is through the vote. Martha beautifully talked about the contested history, the struggle for access to make the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, and Ari talked about the 26th Amendment, make those amendments real. They were words on paper until they were made real. And those struggles happen from the ground up in our communities determined to bend their neighborhoods toward community and away from chaos. I want to say a quick word about that most recent struggle here in New Jersey. So as I mentioned, New Jersey is a state that connects voting to the criminal justice system, and that doing so literally imports racism and racial disparities from the criminal justice system into the political process. 3 years ago, we launched a campaign, a statewide campaign called 1844 No More. And this is a campaign that was connected to the year 1844, when New Jersey first denied the right to vote to everyone except for white men. Put differently, in 1844, New Jersey restricted voting to white men only. And in that same year, New Jersey restricted the right to vote for people with criminal convictions. And this was the law for more than 150 years until we launched a campaign to build a New Jersey that is 1844 no more, so that people with criminal convictions could vote. And we centered in this campaign people who couldn't vote. My colleague Ron Pierce, for example, who spent 30 years in prison, came home on parole, an indefinite length of parole, and talked about how voting has value to the soul, how voting connects individuals to whole communities, how voting has been shown to help restore people to their communities, to enhance public safety, to reduce recidivism. And so this campaign was robust, it was statewide, it was an inclusive community, and we wanted to make New Jersey like Maine and Vermont, yes, but we also wanted to, recognizing the difficult national moment, the chaos at the national level, we wanted to build in New Jersey the most inclusive democracy in the country. So this was an effort to restore the right to vote for people with criminal convictions, those in prison, on probation, and parole. And we were ultimately fortunate to get a bill passed that restored the right to vote to people on probation and parole, and are still fighting to get those folks, those 19,000 people in prison, the right to vote. But this year, after the bill passed, and to the Secretary's point in her opening remarks, in March, this bill became effective. It restored the right to vote to 83,000 people on probation and parole, a population nearly the size of our capital city of Trenton. And Greer, if you would move forward to the next slide. And so this is Tia. Tia lost her right to vote after going to prison just as she turned 18. And I had the honor of joining Tia on election day as she cast her ballot for the first time. She was determined to deliver her vote by mail ballot in person. This is before 6 o'clock on election day. She wanted to be there first. We got there ahead of the opening of the polling place. There were already a few people in line. And she talked about how she finally felt like she was seen. She finally felt like she could be heard, and she could finally have a say in the way that decisions are made about how people live in her community. Tia came home from prison. She opened a home called the Fort House, which is a home for people coming home from prison who are pursuing a college or advanced degree. A 15-person home. Tia is able to establish that, and finally, for the first time in her life, to cast her ballot. Next slide, Greer. This is a slide of Mr. Morris in Paterson, New Jersey. Mr. Morris is 74 years old. He went to a youth prison in New Jersey. It's called Jamesburg Youth Prison for Boys. Jamesburg opened in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. And when it opened, it was populated by mostly newly freed Black people and immigrants. Today, there are 2 white kids in Jamesburg, right? 2 of the 8 in the state. Mr. Morris goes to Jamesburg at 12 for a curfew violation. He's picked up for a curfew violation. He's sent to Jamesburg Youth Prison. And he spends the next 4+ decades in and out of prisons. There was a direct shot from the youth prison he will describe to adult prison, and he spent a lot of years, and he never had the right to vote. He never had the right to vote until this bill passed, and he is now on parole. He voted for the first time. He said, I wanted to wear my best outfit, like they did in the civil rights movement. And he went on to say, there were so many of my ancestors who fought for the right to vote and died without having access to it. He said, today, I voted for them and I voted for me. And I lift this up because this would not have happened without the organization of so many people on this conversation in the state more broadly to make New Jersey in 1844 no more state. And we still have work to do, certainly. We still need to restore the right to vote to people who are in prison, to sever the link between our broken criminal justice system and the fundamental right to vote. I also want to look at two other quick things. So this bill was passed in the middle of a pandemic. Very hard to register to vote if you have to print out a form and return the form. So we were able also to champion online voter registration. It became effective in September. And before registration closed in the middle of October, 400,000 people were able to register to vote online. And then finally, consistent with the work to empower people with criminal convictions to vote, we also wanted to empower people with criminal convictions to be counted accurately in the census, so that for redistricting purposes, their bodies count in their home communities. And so the practice in New Jersey had been to count people in prison, to count them as residents of their prison communities for purpose of the census, for apportioning state and federal resources and state and federal representation. And so we successfully championed a law that now counts people in prison back in their home communities, so that representation and resources are apportioned, are captioned there in their actual communities, not the prison communities where they're staying temporarily, even if they're there for a while. I lift that up because I think what has been inspirational about New Jersey is that we have been trying to build the kind of community, the beloved community that Dr. King talked about, the one that builds our neighborhoods in a way that fosters community and against chaos. But to Ari's point, to Martha's point, there is a long way to go, to be sure. So I want to pause there, and I want to allow time for Q&A. And so I encourage you, if you have questions, please offer them in the chat. I will begin by welcoming Martha and Ari back to the conversation. Again, so thankful to have them on this beautiful, rainy, gray Friday morning. And so I guess I want to just throw this question to you, Ari and Martha. Your presentation, I think if there was a theme to it, it was that, you know, democracy in this country, even now, has been fiercely contested. But it's been led by women, it's been led by Black people, it's been led by people of color more broadly to perfect our democracy, right? To save, as John Lewis would say, to save the soul of our nation. And so, and you talked us through how we moved through the passage of different amendments and how those amendments were made real by fierce struggle by people. And so I would love for you to say a word about how you see this particular moment. So on the other side of, there was a Black president, then there was another president who restored charitably white supremacy to the White House. And now we're on the other side of that. And if you could just talk to us about how you're seeing, how you're characterizing, how you're describing this moment that we're now in and the work to be done in it.
I can jump in, Ari, if that's okay.
Go ahead, please.
So first of all, thank you so much, Ryan, not only for your remarks, but for leading us in this conversation this morning. I think for me, it's important to underscore, I think, a point that each of you made importantly, and that is to underscore the extraordinary hurdles that we were required to not only navigate, but to lift ourselves up over in order to get to the polls in 2020. It's perhaps too easy to rest upon the outcome of the election, to rest upon the record number of voters who did indeed not only cast their ballots, but have their ballots counted. But what would this election have looked like in the absence of voter suppression? What would this election have looked like if, for example, felon disfranchisement was no longer a factor in so many states. That to me is dazzling when we recognize the record number of voters who participated this time around. And at the same time, I think in this country, there is a twisted and almost perverted relationship between the urgency of casting ballots and the fact of voter suppression. You know, that in a sense, some of the most adamant, the most strident proponents of voting rights in this country, those stories, those urgings emerge from communities that have in fact experienced disenfranchisement in our own time, whether it's immigrant communities, whether it is communities of color subject to voter suppression, whether it is formerly incarcerated people. And so my puzzle, if you will, coming out of this election season is about how do we disentangle and excise voter suppression from both our culture, from our narratives, and from our practice around the ballot box. That is less clear to me, and I worry a little bit in all of the talk, and there is a lot of talk about the result of this election. Importantly, you know, some of the factors that you all have pointed to that shaped the outcome and shaped the turnout this season are being minimized, I think.
Yeah, I would just add that I really think our institutions are at a breaking point right now. And I think the election exposed that. And I want to start with the Electoral College. Donald Trump lost by 2.9 million votes in 2016 and got 306 electoral votes. Joe Biden is winning by 5.3 million votes, probably will go up to 6 million votes, and is going to win 306 electoral votes. How is it possible that someone could lose by 3 million and win by 6 million and have the same result in the Electoral College? And on, I guess it was still Tuesday night, it's all kind of a blur right now, but I think it was around Tuesday night at 11 p.m. when people were texting me like crazy saying, what's going on with Wisconsin? What's going on with Michigan? What's going on with Arizona? And Joe Biden had just taken the lead in the popular vote. And you knew it was just going to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. But we were all biting our nails about 5,000 votes here and 6,000 votes there. And by Friday, it was like we were worrying about 73 votes that were coming out of Maricopa County. And like, this is not a sustainable system. I think people need to realize how close we are to just a complete subversion of democracy when millions and millions and millions and millions of votes just don't matter. So that's one thing. You look at the US Senate right now. I mean, Democrats are going to represent millions and millions and millions of more Americans, but right now, Republicans are still going to retain control of the Senate, pending what happens in the runoffs in Georgia. You look at state legislatures. Democratic candidates for state legislatures got more votes in states like North Carolina. In North Carolina, Democratic candidates for the state house got 54% of votes, but only 44% of seats. So we have a problem in that the popular will does not translate into our institutions, that our institutions are fundamentally undemocratic. And it's not enough to say we have the 15th Amendment, we have the 19th Amendment, we have the 26th Amendment. We need changes, deep changes. First off, we need a new constitutional amendment guaranteeing everyone the right to vote in this country. If we don't, I understand it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next year. If we don't get that, voter suppression will just continue for our entire history. So that has to be the aspirational goal, to say that everyone has a right to vote in this country. You can only disqualify people for very, very narrow, specific things, but you have to have blanket protections. Short of that, I think we need a complete modernization of our electoral system. People voted in spite of all of these barriers, but it was insane. It was insane that it was super easy to vote by mail in Oregon, but almost impossible to vote by mail in Texas. It was crazy that Michigan had 1,000 drop boxes for mail voting and Ohio had 88 drop boxes. It was crazy that people could vote from prison in Vermont, but Florida disenfranchised 775,000 people with past felony convictions after voters said that these people should be given a right to vote. So I'm still angry, as you guys can see, about how this election has played out. And I don't want people to become complacent because Joe Biden won Georgia by 14,000 votes, Arizona by 12,000 votes, and Wisconsin by 20,000 votes. That's not a massive victory when you compare it to how much bigger the victory should have been based on the number of votes that were actually counted.
Yeah, great points. All right, so I do want to encourage folks watching us to purchase Ari and Martha's books. There are links to their books in the chat. So there's a related question, Ari, to your point, which you should weigh into on it as well, Martha, but it asks, do you anticipate do you anticipate that in the next decade, at least one amendment to the U.S. Constitution explicitly increasing prohibitions against voting discrimination will pass?
I mean, not with the current makeup of states right now. I mean, I'm really worried that we're going to start going backwards at a very rapid pace, that when these state legislatures start to meet in next year, the first thing they're going to do is pass really crazy gerrymandered maps, and that they are going to pass new restrictions on voting to try to prevent the kind of turnout that we saw in 2020 from happening again. And I'm very, very concerned about what a 6-3 Supreme Court will do. I know Martha is studying this right now, but I think you have to go back and look at the Supreme Courts of the late 1800s and early 1900s to really get a feeling of what this current Supreme Court is going to look like. They are going to be an incredible impediment to any kind of advances with democracy. And I'm concerned that there's going to be gridlock in Washington, and it's not going to be possible to pass legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act. And it's not going to be possible to pass efforts to make it harder to vote. So I think that this is just the beginning of a pro-democracy agenda, but I think we have to be clear-eyed about the difficulty of getting it through and all the work that still has to be done to actually make it possible.
If I could jump in, I want to say I'm also someone who has written promoting the notion that we need a constitutional amendment that guarantees for the first time by way of the federal constitution the right to vote to all citizens. Shy of that, I would suggest, and since we're speaking to an audience of folks in New Jersey, it's important to say, if you are a leader in a state like New Jersey and you pride yourself, as in my home state of Maryland, lawmakers certainly do, if you pride yourself on not having engaged in now the promotion of voter suppression, if you pride yourself on getting New Jerseyans to the polls without barriers, why not amend the New Jersey state constitution to guarantee to every citizen of the state of New Jersey the right to vote? In other words, someone has to set the high bar. Someone has to be the example in this country. And the likelihood that we will get that at the federal level, I think, is tough, difficult, not likely at all in the next decade. But we have states, right, that for whom the pride is that they are not meting out voting rights the way they are meted out in the state of Georgia or Texas, or name the state. But still, in my home state of Maryland, we do not guarantee anyone the right to vote. We mirror a federal system that curbs the strictures on voting rights, but still leaves the burden on citizens to do the heavy lifting, to get over the hurdles, to navigate a pandemic. The burden should be on the state to ensure that everyone has access to a ballot, that they can cast that ballot, and that ballot is counted. And that should be a promise in the state constitution.
And Martha, can you say a word? So with the right to vote, either found in the state constitution or federal constitution, what does that afford voters that we don't have at this time?
It shifts the burden to the state, right? That still today, the burden is on citizens, right? To navigate inadequate polling places and facilities, to stand in unconscionable long lines, to have to lobby and beg for mail-in ballots in a season where no public health official would countenance the view that folks should be gathering in situations like polling places. I want to shift the burden to the state and make it an affirmative obligation of the state of New Jersey to ensure that everyone who wants to cast a ballot has the opportunity to cast that ballot. And I will leave it to the experts, right, to determine how to fulfill that obligation. But I think the first step is making that an obligation of the state. And we still live in a system where too much of the burden falls to citizens and too many people fall between the cracks.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I appreciate that point as one who's been in the state, doing state-based work for the last 5 years. We have been using, so we have a lot of elected officials in Jersey who think of themselves as like progressive, like Ari Berman, like this is who we are, it's in our heart. Sometimes even get teary-eyed when they start talking about democracy. Now, sometimes their actual practices are very far from the teary-eye they drop, but we've been able to say, look, this is who you say you are, right? You say you're not fill in the blank other state. And if that's not who we are, right, if we are about community, not chaos, then we should be moving some of these very progressive bills, like restoring voting rights. So I think also, things like same-day voter registration, that's something New Jersey needs to have ASAP, right? And so I love your point that the state's whole real promise to advance some of these really progressive voting measures. And Ari, in light of your less than optimistic projection at the federal level, the question that was asked is, can something like that happen in 10 years? But how do you see that happening, and what is the time frame by which something like that could happen at the federal level?
Yeah, I think you're right, Ryan, that the states need to be the laboratories for change. And that's really important because, for example, when mail voting became a big thing this year, you could point to states where it had worked successfully. So you could point to Oregon and Washington and Utah and other states, and their secretaries of state could go and say, hey, this works great here. There's no reason we can't do it everywhere. And so I think the states need to be the laboratories for change. And I understand, like in New York, where I am, people are very wound up about voter suppression in Texas and Georgia and other places, but elections are a mess in New York. And we need to look in our own backyard and figure out why vote by mail isn't working, why we're throwing out so many ballots, why there's so much confusion. I mean, there were more problems with voting by mail in New York than there were in Georgia, which isn't to take Georgia off the hook. I think there's a difference between administrative error and outright voter suppression. But a lot of people are confusing those things. And so the dysfunction in New York gave Trump an opportunity to tweet about it over and over and say, look at New York and how screwed up mail voting is. Why should we do this nationally? And it fell to those of us with nuance to explain, like, there's different issues in New York, but you had to grant the point that things weren't working as well here as they could be. And so that's why I think it's really important in states where there is a possibility of change, in states that are more progressive, people have to be as aggressive at expanding voting rights as those people are in other states about suppressing voting rights. And I feel very, very strongly about that because I think it both helps voters in these states, but I think it also creates an alternative model. And states are looking at what other states are doing. That's very, very clear, especially now when election laws vary in so many places. So I think, it starts at a state level. And then I think it also starts by putting the issue of voting front and center. And that's what was different about 2020, was that voting itself, yes, it was so contested, which was very disturbing, but also people had so much more awareness about how to vote. And there was so much more of a movement to overcome voter suppression than in past elections. And that's the thing we have to keep pushing forward. And then for the younger generation, drawing the links between voting power and outcomes, right? So a lot of people voted and they want to see something for their vote. They want to see something done about climate change. They want to see something done about police brutality. They want to see something done about the pandemic. They want to see something done about all of the problems that we have. And so I think that's the next step is trying to get people to see the links between voting and progress. Because ultimately, that's what the civil rights movement was about. That's what the women's rights movement was about, right, guys? I mean, it wasn't about having the vote for the vote's sake. It was about having the vote so you could be treated as equal citizens in society, right? With all of the rights that go along with that. And so we have to keep a broad picture of why voting is so important. It's not just about the vote itself, it's about all the things that come after it.
Yeah, great point. There's a related question for you, Martha. This comes from Sue Kozel, who says that in your book, Vanguard, you write about Stacey Abrams and her voter mobilization efforts at the end of the book. Can you describe Stacey's present leadership on voter mobilization in order to discuss the future of Black women's political leadership?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, I end with great trepidation. I end Vanguard with Leader Abrams because, of course, I'm composing a conclusion to a book at the end of 2019 and not knowing where and quite Leader Abrams will be when the book is released months later. But I'm happy to say I think that her work has remained true to the spirit of where I end in Vanguard, which is to point out that Leader Abrams is an example for me of Black women's style of political leadership, which has always necessitated a kind of nimbleness. What do I mean by that? That because Black women are disenfranchised for so much of our history, many of them until 1965 and passage of the Voting Rights Act, it wasn't possible to rest on a notion of political power as embodied in your influence at the ballot box or on election day. It was necessary to be organizers. It was necessary to understand how to use patronage. It was necessary to infiltrate party politics. It was necessary to have a kind of repertoire that could be enhanced, certainly, and expanded by access to the ballot box and office holding, but never really rests or is narrowed to that sort of vision for political leadership. And one of the things I admire about Leader Abrams is that when, and this is my view, when she has the governorship of Georgia stolen from her by voter suppression and more, she doesn't simply sit down. She doesn't simply retreat and raise money to fuel her next run for the governorship or beyond. She pivots to organize along with an extraordinary team of folks in the state of Georgia through Fair Fight and in important coalitions to do, I dare say, precisely what we saw done in this election cycle, right? Which is to bring, I think, and I hope Ari will correct me, but the numbers are something like 800,000 voters, right, to the polls in the state of Georgia by way of this grassroots organizing. Now, Leader Abrams will go on, I think we all hope, to have a long and varied political career, and she certainly appears poised to run for public office again. But this style of leadership, which is responsive to conditions, which is not a pure or self-serving drive for individual power, is very much a reflection of the necessity, but the style and the vision for Black women in politics. And she is, I think, as she herself has put it, an inheritor of that political tradition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ari, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the purpose of voting wasn't just for the vote's sake, but it was to get folks to do things. And so you mentioned earlier the power of the Black vote in places like Atlanta and Milwaukee and Philly. Can you say a word now on the other side of this election with a new president and a historic first and the vice presidential position, what it means to hold these elected officials accountable and to get through some of those things you talked about the vote being designed to do for these communities?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it was just so stark. I mean, all we have is the exit poll data now, so we don't know how accurate it is, but I mean, it's pretty clear. Donald Trump won the white vote overwhelmingly, and he won not only white men, but he won white women again. as well. So for all the talk about the wokeness of the white community, they did not change their mind by and large. Yes, there were probably a little bit of movement in, for example, more affluent white communities in the suburbs of Atlanta. There was probably a little bit of movement away from Donald Trump, not because of the policies, but because of the crudeness of his behavior. But by and large, white voters stuck with Donald Trump. And I think it's unrealistic to expect them ever to move, because I think as the demographics of the country change, the hold on white supremacy will become more and more urgent. And white voters are going to feel more and more displaced right now. And they are going to be even more aggressive about trying to protect a majority that is slipping away. So I fully expect this kind of tribalism and polarization to get worse, not better, which is why the growing segments of the electorate become that much more important. Not just Black voters, but voters of color writ large. If you look at Georgia, the coalition of there is Black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, new voters, voters that are relocating in a reverse migration from the North back to the South. I mean, that really is the future of Georgia. And Georgia is changing in ways that the rest of the country is changing. So it really is, in many ways, encapsulates the demographic changes that are occurring. And so, I mean, I think it's the things that people voted for now have to be priorities. Things like criminal justice reform have to be top priorities from the administration. I already hear people saying, oh, we need to back away from defund the police. We need to back away from those kind of things. We can argue about the phrasing, how you talk about it, but I don't think anyone can argue about the urgency of needing to solve these kind of problems. You might not want to talk about defund the police, but you have to deal with the issue of police brutality and misconduct. And I don't think anyone doubts that right now. And so I think just kind of doubling down on appealing to white conservatism, I think is going to be a loser for the country, but I think it's also going to be a loser for the Democratic Party, because I don't think those voters at the end of the day are really movable. And I mean, Martha, I can only imagine what you felt when you saw Kamala Harris come out in that white pantsuit. I mean, it was just an incredibly powerful moment. And, you know, it just kind of, I think a lot of people in a lot of ways took Obama's election for granted. And then only with Trump did people understand how fragile a lot of this progress is. And then, so I think for then to have Kamala there, I think it really gave a sense of history and purpose. And it was so many things coming together, the 19th Amendment, the VRA, all of that stuff. And Biden always said he's a transitional figure. And so Kamala, that's the future of the country, and that's the future of the party. So even though she's only vice president, we don't know how much power she has. But as a political figure, as a symbol, to me, the Harris part of the Biden-Harris administration is a lot more important than the Biden part when you project what this will mean for the future of American politics.
She was very explicit about that, I thought, in her Saturday night remarks, whereas when she accepted the nomination, sort of she rooted that moment in this history of African-American women in politics. And what she spoke to on Saturday night in now what was her victory remarks, she spoke about a coalition of American women that included Black women, of course, but expanded to Native women, Asian women, Latinx women, etc. And that was, to me, a new framing of who she is, and perhaps who she is going forward. I, for one, if I could just parenthetically say that we haven't talked enough yet, and I'm sure we will in the coming hours and days, about Arizona and who makes the difference in a state like Arizona. But the Navajo Nation is taking important credit for the results in a close race there. And so I think it was important that Senator Harris speak, yes, to Black women, but speak to Latinx women, Asian women, Native women, because this is part of how we get where we are. And I too am looking at the exit poll numbers, which confirm precisely that white women are the outliers among American women in that they voted disproportionately for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's powerful. So we just have a few minutes left. I want to encourage folks watching to access the link in the chat to purchase Ari and Martha's books. And I'll ask this last question. It's sort of where do we go from here question. It comes from John Johnson Jr., who asks, what are some of the opportunities for high school students, including those who may not be of voting age, and college students, some of whom may be undocumented and unable to vote, to get engaged in expanding and protecting the right to vote? And I'll kick that to you, Martha, and you, Ari, for the final word, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I think it's very important to say that one of the lessons out of the women of Vanguard, African-American women who spend generations without access to the polls, is that there are many ways to build political power and influence. And I think one of the things we've seen in 2020 is the power of organizers. And one need not be eligible to vote to be an organizer. One need not be a citizen of the United States in order to be an organizer. And so I think if we take a page from Leader Abrams, but from so many across this country who were in the trenches and were active in the ground game that got us to November, organizing, I think, is the key word. That having been said, I met yesterday evening in an event in Trenton, a young woman out of Georgia, 18 years old, in the state of Georgia, young African-American woman who managed to get herself elected an elector to the Electoral College. And it was remarkable because it spoke back, right, to the notion, right, that young people are not engaged. It spoke back to the notion that there is not a place for young people and more. And she described, right, being counseled to sit down, to wait, to hold back, to let others take the lead. But there she is, of course, now poised to, out of Atlanta, cast her ballot in the admittedly troubled scene of the Electoral College. But to me, it was an example of how young people need to push us to recognize their place in American politics. And so I was very grateful for that lesson from her.
That's an amazing story. I want to talk to that girl. But I mean, one of the most amazing things that happened in this election was 700,000 new people signed up to be poll workers because so many poll workers were elderly and at risk. And so you had 16-year-olds who weren't even able to vote working the polls in states like Georgia, and they got trained like everybody else, and all their friends did it. And it reminded me of those wartime mobilizations when everyone has to step up because we're in a crisis. And this election was a crisis. This was not business as usual. And really, the only way to have a smooth election was to everyone do their part. And I think that's what we saw. We saw everyone do their part, whether it was volunteering to be a poll worker or requesting your ballot early or giving people rides to the polls. I mean, a tremendous amount of civic engagement, to me, is a blueprint. And there's no reason why we can't do this every election cycle, why people can't volunteer as poll workers and we train a whole new generation of election officials, why sports arenas can't be voting sites every single election so that there aren't long lines at the polls. And I think that the seeds were planted in 2020. And those people that got involved for the first time, they're going to be the leaders of 2021 and 2022. And so I think there's been a really important seed planted in 2020 with so many new people getting involved and actually seeing how they made a difference. Because I think people can feel really good about the work that they did. And when we had, the goal always was record turnout. And that's what we had. We had record turnout. Now, there's a lot of people who didn't vote. There are a lot of people who weren't able to vote. But at the end of the day, I would say, from my standpoint, we hit a lot of the goals we had in terms of trying to have a relatively smooth election in a pandemic and have high turnout at a time of massive voter suppression. And so I would just urge young people, young organizers to keep doing what they're doing and to build on the work of 2020 and to not do what happened in 2008, which is for everyone to say, we did this and now go home. That's the thing that we can't do. I think people understand that now, and they didn't in 2008, but I think John Lewis always said that democracy is not an act, democracy is a mind state. And so we have to have the mind state of democracy 24/7, 365 days a year. We're all tired, I'm tired, we all need a break. We can take a few weeks off, but we have to get back in it because democracy is not going anywhere, and it's up to all of us to make it better.
Thank you so much. So Ari Berman, Professor Martha S. Jones, and I see Sarah is on the line to close us out. It's been great to spend this time with you all. And again, please, viewers, in the chat, you can get Martha's book and Ari's book. Ari's book is over his left shoulder there, on the second shelf there.
And I just want to add my thanks to all three of you for an amazing opening session, so much to think about, and some great references to be reading and sharing with others. So thank you, all three of you. And to everyone else, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. We have a lot more ahead. So thanks and enjoy for the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thanks so much.